Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon session as part of Climate Finance Week. What's been a fantastic week so far of very busy and packed agendas and some really interesting talks and sessions. This session this afternoon is focused on financing Ireland's climate action plan. And I am delighted to be joined by a very interesting panel to talk through it today. So my name is James Delahunt. I am a director within KPMG's corporate finance practice and focus and specialise within renewable energy and the broader sustainability and climate agenda. And I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Farmer, a colleague who is a director in KPMG's Sustainable Futures team, Ireland's largest climate and decarbonisation and sustainability advisory team based in Dublin. He brings with him nearly 2 decades of investment management experience with a particular focus on the application of ESG from both a commercial and regulatory perspective. I'm also delighted to welcome Donal Welton. Donal is Head of Agriculture with AIB in Ireland, and Donal focuses on providing financing solutions to small, medium and large farmers and businesses focused in the agriculture and food sector. I'm also joined by Anne-Marie Keane. Anne-Marie is Group Treasurer with ESB Group. And of course, ESB Group were responsible for the placement of Ireland's first green bond in 2019 and a subsequent bond in January 2022. And Anne-Marie was involved in these transactions and will provide insights and perspectives in relation to this. So really looking forward to hearing a little bit more on that from Anne-Marie. And also from another colleague, Terence McGovern. So Terence is a director in KPMG's Sustainable Futures team and leads KPMG's energy and decarbonisation service offering, bringing a wealth of experience from time in industry and supporting clients on their decarbonisation journey. He's an expert in renewable and flexibility technologies and has a wealth of experience across the energy system from HV transmission to sustainable fuels. So what we're going to seek, I think this is penciled in for an hour, but we hope to kind of get through it in about 40 minutes or 45 minutes or so to give you a bit of time back towards the end. And I believe there's a Q&A function to allow you to submit questions, which I'll seek to get to over the course of it. I'm going to start initially by just walking through a few slides myself to kind of set the scene and set the context. We will have heard quite a lot over the course of the week through the various different sessions that we have attended about the climate action plan and about the decarbonisation journey of the climate action plan and various financing initiatives around that from the various different speakers over the course of the week. So what I'll seek to do at the outset is just provide a degree of quantification in terms of the amounts of capital that are required for the various limbs of the climate action plan, and then perhaps where those sources of capital will come from. And in my mind, we kind of broadly bucket it between public capital provided by the state in some form, private capital through investment funds and banking arrangements, and citizen capital, as I describe it. So people, the transition will be part of the citizen agenda and where they will sit in. I'll give a flavour for the growth across the broader sustainable finance agenda, and then maybe give a flavour for some of the funds that we see active in the market that have been raised. Then I'm going to pass it to my colleague Andrew, who has spent quite a significant amount of time in the investment management industry and will give a flavour for where he's seeing the trends go and give an international perspective. So if we look at the climate action plan, what needs to be financed? And as I often look at the climate action plan, which was ultimately initially published in 2019 and updated in 2021, which is due to be further updated, it breaks down effectively 125 billion of total capital that will need to be deployed as estimated in 2021 in order to deliver on the objectives of the plan. Certainly from what I'm seeing in terms of my own practices, when we see this updated, we fully expect that capital number to be updated, not only because of inflation and cost pressures that are happening generally within the economic environment, but also just by the nature that the climate agenda will evolve, and there's the demand for the kind of products, services that are going to be needed to ultimately deliver on the transition agenda is going to be a key component of it. So again, the stated investment requirement of the Climate Action Plan of 2021 is expected to be in excess of 125 billion. And depending on how you characterize it, I would ultimately see that as being much more. So how would we break that down into sectoral components? So the first one that I would look at is ultimately the electricity system. So we'll all be very familiar with the Ireland's Climate Action Plan target of achieving 80% renewable electricity by 2030. And this is ultimately a tripling of what has been installed over the last 2.5 years, while it's a doubling of our percentage of renewable electricity. With the demand growth that's going to happen in terms of electricity over that period of time, it's ultimately going to result in a doubling of the, or a tripling rather, of the overall generation capacity. That will result in how current estimates set out a kind of 22 billion across wind and solar projects themselves, and that takes onshore solar and offshore into account. And I think the estimates on the offshore sector alone over the longer term, which goes beyond 2030, will be significantly in excess of that. And then if you take the whole grid network we have there defined on the right-hand side as TSO, DSO upgrades, interconnection backup capacity. But if you take non-core project related spend, that is in the region of 13 to 16 billion estimated as well. So in total, 37 billion of capital on the electricity system. And what always strikes me is it's something that isn't necessarily discussed and thought about to the same extent. We've lived through a period where money has been plentiful and readily available with low interest rates and often negative interest rates. When that economic environment has shifted as it now has, it'll be interesting to see how that's deployed. The other sectors then is the transport as we go to the electrification of vehicles, both, and that will ultimately be funded from a citizen's perspective in terms of the purchase of just general electric cars, but also from the state's perspective as an EV electric charging infrastructure gets implemented. In total, it's estimated at over 50 billion when you take in passenger cars, trucks, vans, charging infrastructures, and other transport modes such as trains. And I'd be interested to hear ESB's perspective on that, particularly from a charging infrastructure perspective. Then when we think of homes and buildings, when we look at ultimately the renewable aspects of renewable heat and the electrification of the home. So installation in buildings of about 14 billion, heat pumps in homes of about 10 billion. And then we take broader buildings and district heating, all in totaling 35 billion of a capital requirement. We'll be very familiar at the July when the country was ultimately setting its decarbonisation targets for the agricultural sector, that agri is going to be a key component of the decarbonisation agenda and in Ireland achieving its targets. From a capital requirement, I'll leave it to Donald to kind of draw on it. It's not necessarily quantified and set out in the Climate Action Plan. It's more set that there'll be a target reduction through things such as the adjustment of the livestock, but also innovation within farming itself is going to be a key component so that the agricultural community remains sustainable and jobs and livelihoods are maintained within that. And then in the other sections, enterprise is set out. Enterprise is broadly set out in terms of actual corporates and businesses that will be funded through the likes of IDA, Enterprise Ireland and SEAI through grant schemes to promote employment in decarbonisation and emission reductions initiatives. And then in terms of the overall broader heat pumps and furnaces, that's set out at 2 billion, but depending on where you bucket, electrification and homes and buildings piece, that ultimate quantum will be significantly higher. Other areas which I'll just touch on briefly will be land use, reforestry and marine, particularly the reforestation agenda, and then the broader circular economy and areas such as the just transition will all have capital requirements, albeit they aren't necessarily quantified. So when we think of that, there is a large period, there's a large portion of the agenda that needs some degree of financing, and this will come through the forms of sustainable finance. So we would have heard about various aspects of sustainable finance over the course of this week, so we won't necessarily go into depths on it, but I'd just like to touch on some of the key trends that we are seeing within sustainable finance. And it won't surprise people to understand, well, look, it's ultimately growth in these capitals. When you see that quantum of capital required to deliver the Climate Action Plan, ultimately that means that capital markets will be attracted to the investment opportunities. But I think it's incumbent on the capital market system, from policymakers, to ensure that they design policies and design initiatives to enable that mobilization of that capital into those sectors to deliver on the overall goals. Sustainable finance, as broadly defined, is any form of investment or lending decision that takes into account ESG or broader economic activities of a project. And for our mind, it's very much maintaining access to capital in the real economy, ensuring effective allocation of that capital through participation in the financial markets, and then maintaining resilience of the financial system. Ultimately, it's forms of capital that will be dedicated to the climate transition agenda. We've seen that this is no longer a niche. It's grown. This chart illustrates from the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance the quantum of assets under management that categorize within sustainable finance investment, which is currently has grown from a base of 13 trillion to $35 trillion, and is again forecasted to grow exponentially. And I would certainly expect that hockey stick to grow further. Andrew's going to touch a little bit on that after another slide or two. In terms of the pools of capital that are mobilizing to the agenda, it breaks down, to my mind, often between, as I said, state and private sector, where we have there in terms of governments and sovereign wealth funds, to private sector broadly defined as corporates, through the likes of pension funds, through the financial services sector or insurance life companies, banks in the likes of green bonds and private equity, or indeed in relation to more broader corporates such as the oil and gas community and power and utilities, who will be key enablers to the funding of that electricity component. What's not on that page there then is the citizen factor, which will be citizens investing in the space. Private equity as a source is one that is getting very key levels of attention. So if you think of all of the largest private equity and asset and investment managers throughout the world, I think there was a running joke in the investment community that if you didn't have a press release in the Financial Times announcing how many billions you were investing into a climate transition fund, you are no longer relevant. And while that was kind of said jokingly, it is very true. The likes of Blackstone, Brookfield have announced transition funds in the tens of billions. And while certainly from a corporate finance practitioner's perspective, focusing on this agenda, it's interesting to actually speak to them. And they have challenges. They say, we have raised this capital. It was relatively easy to raise the capital because people want access to the opportunity, but we just don't know where the opportunities are to deploy it. So that goes to the policymakers going, well, look, similar to how Ireland ultimately built our roads network through having an effective project finance, public private sector participation regime, we need to be creative in terms of how we design the same to mobilize this capital. And if we look in 2021, 63 new low carbon funds were raised alone, amounting to $37 billion of capital looking to be deployed into decarbonisation technologies alone. Finally, one area that I'll touch on is also corporates. So corporates are going to be key in the support of funding their own supply chain. I think there's been some very interesting sessions this week in terms of how science-based target initiatives and scope 2 and 3 in terms of how corporates are assessing their supply chain being a key component of the ESG agenda. One layer to that is, well, if they want to ultimately enable their supply chain to be greener, a lot of these are funding it. An obvious area is in the energy space, where we're seeing traditional oil and gas be one of the largest and most significant investors within the renewable energy and climate transition agenda in the world. I'm going to pause there maybe and hand over to my colleague Andrew Farmer, who again is a director within our Sustainable Futures practice in KPMG and focuses on investment management. And he's just going to give a flavour from an international perspective what he's seeing.
Great, thank you so much, James. So from an international perspective, James was so kind as to introduce this slide, this global view of kind of the widest definition of sustainability. As we think about the last decade and really looking at assets deployed within the space as a mark of demand, it's grown incredibly. So nearly threefold in that time period. And more importantly, as we look to the future, an acceleration of growth. As you can see in the steepening curve here, it's expected by a study undertaken by GSAI and Bloomberg that ultimately the flow of capital and the rate at which demand is growing is expected to increase, which is very promising, particularly as many of these allocators are looking to places like Ireland and partnerships with the public sector to finance projects that will change tomorrow. If we zoom out a bit and look at the globe, I wanted to touch on this next slide on the overall asset flows within the global capital markets. So not surprisingly to many of my peers, Europe and the UK continue to lead in terms of asset flows into sustainable funds. This captures a universe that spans all the way from fixed income product to alternatives. And really what this shows you from a leadership point of view of Europe and making up more than 60% of the overall asset flows in the second quarter of this year is that there's certainly a wealth of opportunity that at least the capital markets believe sits within Europe. As we look to other jurisdictions in the world, I would be remiss if I didn't include my own home country, and just wanted to give a little bit of color on what we're seeing in the States and some of the headwinds associated with these flows. As you can see, it's the only negative flow for the quarter. And what we're seeing in the States outside of the influence of other dynamics in the capital markets is an increasing politicization of ESG or sustainability within the political discourse in the States. And so ultimately, I think this is something that over time will right itself, but we have seen a slowdown within the States and North America more broadly. As we look to Asia, ex-Japan, and the Australia, Japan region, one of the things that's notable is that if you look back further in time, they have grown quite a bit from a quarter over quarter flows perspective. Now, product development, being stabilized in the second quarter, it's an estimated 245 new sustainable funds have hit the shelves. And what's really important, I think, to focus on is where the Irish funds industry has taken on a role in this overall process of the capital markets and allocating capital towards those projects that quite honestly, from a philosophical point of view, are something that you can get behind, and also from the perspective of acting as leadership within the investment fund space. One other thing to note, and this is particularly relevant to, I think, the financing of projects locally and globally, is the financing options that sit within sustainability-linked loans, green bonds, and other grant opportunities. And I'll really highlight the first two. James, could you go on to the next slide? So as you can see, the biggest part of the market in terms of debt issuance over the last nearly decade has been within the green bond space. As I mentioned earlier, sustainability-linked loans has also been a pretty material part of that. And so as you see, from nearly 28 billion in 2013 to 1.6 billion in new issuance as of the end of last year, it's a really incredible growth rate within that market, and particularly green bonds, with 2021's issuance of almost 700 billion. It certainly represents an opportunity to deploy capital and meet that demand from the global capital markets.
Okay, great, Andrew. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and just drop it down. Look, that's absolutely super, and kind of gives a helpful insight and perspective from an international lens. What's particularly timely then is perhaps, Anne-Marie, to touch on you in the first instance. particularly given your experience with ESB being responsible for the placement of Ireland's first bond in 2019. Maybe just give us an example of what that process has been like, the subsequent one in 22 is like, how they differed, and what the requirements are to raise one, and what the sources of funds will be used.
Yep, great. Thanks, James, and thanks for the invite. Great to be here. So maybe just to give you a sense of the process, I'd say, like in terms back in 2019, it started well before we raised the bond. So there was a period of time of onboarding the business and the need to do this. So we were seeing very clear signs in the treasury business that moving towards green bonds, sustainability linked bonds was what the market was going to look like. We, particularly as a utility, particularly with the strategy that we have, which is it's a very, very green strategy, investors are expecting us to be doing the right thing in this space. And we were getting messages that if we weren't going the green route, that we might not have access to the same kind of a loan book. So we started a couple of years before the 2019 bond. There would have been lots and lots of discussions with our banking bodies, just in terms of getting advice as regards what should be done here, with the likes of the NTMA and Sustainable Nation Ireland, to get ourselves up to do that. We did a launch internally within ESB with our executive directors to make sure that that the business was on board. So this is a very different proposition to raising a regular bond, where our treasury team would be 100% in control of the data and the information. It's very much a finance-based activity. This is a much more broad business initiative, and you need a far wider range of people involved. So it was a very easy sell at an exec level, very keen to do this, very, very aligned to our strategy. But I suppose what it did lead on to was a very significant piece of work that wouldn't necessarily have been there before. So the green framework, we developed a green framework, which sounds very simple, but in terms of like the work involved in developing that framework was immense. It's not now reliant entirely on financial information. It's reliant on going back out to the businesses, understanding what it is they're planning on doing, and thinking through, how we're going to report against that. So, like in some senses, like if you look at our business, we have a generation business with a very big appetite for building, which is great. So we have a 5 gigawatt target in the generation side of the house. That's from 1 gigawatt at the moment. So we do have a pipeline behind that, very clear, easy for the business, easy for the banks to see, easy for investors to understand. But outside of that, we also have some other businesses with significant investment where it's not as clear, and the link to that green agenda isn't as clear. So we did manage to, say, on the network side, to pull out explicit investments associated with the smart metering program, because it's a real enabler of the green agenda. And we will be looking for other opportunities on the network side. Obviously, connecting renewables is a very big part of success of the strategy and success of the climate action plan. But directly linking that under the rules that were in place back in 2019 was difficult. It is something that has changed. So we're getting really positive feedback now that, particularly with the EU taxonomy, that there are opportunities for us to include some of our additional expenditures. So that's in the piece of work going forward, and I might just touch on that briefly later. But in terms of process, it's been around getting that green framework up and running. That was very much a cross-functional team to do that. Lots of engineers in the room, which wouldn't have been in the room historically, determining what the projects were and how we were going to measure those. The process itself, once those documentations were in place and we had a second party opinion, I think it went relatively well with investors. We obviously would have had a strong sales pitch on the green side. We saw very clearly a green analyst appearing with investors. So investors now are not seeing this as their regular analysts questioning on this. It's very much a standalone person who's 100% focused on that. So lots of focus, lots of questions, and lots of engagement. We're always asked whether this has saved us money, and the reality is it doesn't save that much money. So we think there's 5 to 10 basis points in this. So this for us isn't around getting better margins out there in the market. This is around ensuring that investors are willing to continue to invest in us, And we did see on that 2019 issue, and again in our issue earlier on this year, that there was a very strong book for these trades, which is positive. So we're absolutely committed to this being the future, and we'd like to expand it along to some of the spend in our other businesses.
And
maybe
one
just
thing we used to hear, Anne-Marie, is that there wasn't necessarily a green premium to be realized because interest rates were so low, and when you would have raised that in 2019, so is a green bond a magic way to getting a cheaper form of finance? That certainly wasn't the case. Would it be your expectation now in the higher interest rate environment that might be an option?
The clear guidance we're getting is that no, it won't be. So we'd expect that premium to remain to be 5, maximum 10%, and that to be the case even if we move towards sustainability-linked bonds, which arguably are tying the business even more so into what investors would require. But banks are basically saying we're expected to do this at this moment. So we're a utility business. We have a mandate to do this. It's part of our strategy. They'll pay us a premium, but it's going to be very small. And it's in the loan book for us. It's having the interest in us is the real key benefit for us.
Okay.
So I suppose going forward, there's so we did that in 2019. We agreed our framework. As I say, a lot of work put into it. We didn't revise that materially for 2022, but again, as everybody is seeing, and you've probably been hearing all week, there's been a huge amount of changes happening in this area over the last couple of years. So we see ourselves having to do quite a bit of work over the next year or so to update ourselves and to be ready. And maybe just particularly, I suppose, the EU taxonomy, we haven't built that in to our framework, and we need to do that. And as I say, building in a lot more of our investment associated with our network business is something that we would hope to be able to do as part of that. We need to consider whether we want to aim for EU green bond standard certification, which is a fairly big bar, but again, this is very clearly aligned to our strategy. We should certainly be aiming to do that. I think there's a question about the timing of us actually being able to achieve that. And assuming we go down that road, we will want to be looking at a taxonomy alignment exercise, and we would want to be looking at reporting, so our impact statements would take that into account. So it's quite immense in terms of the level of detail that we would go into in terms of our planning and how we would report against that. Science-based targets is very current. I think you touched on it there. We do have a commitment to have those in. We have a net zero target for 2040, and investors are becoming increasingly interested in seeing what the pathway to those kind of targets are. So sustainability-linked bonds were very popular there for a period of time because they were linked back to specific targets. Investors have got very nervous about that because they're not confident that the targets that companies are setting are challenging enough. The benefit of having a science-based target would be we would have a very clear plan as regards how we're going to achieve it, and we would report very clearly, and it would give investors assurance, and hopefully that would give us a bit of an edge in terms of being out there in the market. So again, there's a huge amount of work required to do that.
Yeah,
so,
very good.
Yeah.
Look, that's very insightful, Anne-Marie. I've probably got a million questions for you off the back of that, that I could potentially ask. But one thing that really does strike me about that is just the level of work involved in it, the amount of teams, advisors that must have been involved in actually delivering in that. And that's certainly where you get to the mega scale bond, which will be key to delivering some of the major infrastructure type projects. Donald, when I think of your practice as head of agriculture within AIB and the broader AIB group, there's the bond level, which supporting the likes of Anne-Marie in terms of the delivery of the major projects. But in terms of your practice, you must see everything from that stage right down to kind of the smaller farmer that's going to be on a decarbonisation journey of innovation, where they're just applying for a loan themselves to the kind of medium-sized business that might have one accountant or financial advisor assisting. Maybe give a flavour for your work where you're seeing climate as a key, and what kind of aspects of the climate action plan your finance will enable.
Yeah, thanks, James. And firstly, thanks very much for the invitation to participate this afternoon. At the outset, I want to say that, look, agriculture, we have a very positive track record in supporting the agricultural sector. It's a very good business for us, and we continue in the future to support our agricultural customers as they will transition to a greener future. And we're already starting seeing that over the last number of months, and particularly in the last 12 or 18 months. As you alluded to in your slide, James, I suppose the challenge facing agriculture is that there is no one solution to transition to a greener future, rather than it's a series of management practices that each farmer will have to make that will cumulatively lead to a greener future for that particular business. There is no silver bullet. I should say at the outset, though, that there is certainly some very positives with regard to what's happening on the Irish agricultural sector. Firstly, our starting position in this journey, we're starting from a very good position. The European Commission, EU joint research would say that Ireland, our dairy systems, is the second most carbon efficient producer of dairy in the world after New Zealand. And also our beef systems are the 5th most carbon efficient producers in the EU. And that's predominantly based because of our outdoor grass-based systems of production, which is underpinned by a family farm structure, where the average herd size on our dairy farms is less than 80-85 cows. The average herd size on our beef farms is between 15 and 20 animals. So family farm systems of production. I suppose the other key competitive advantage that Irish farmers have is that I think we're the envy of the world, because we have a world-leading sustainability programme that is administered by an independent third party, Board BIA, that is audited, where farmers participating in that scheme are audited every 18 months. And farmers in that scheme get a carbon footprint intensity emission figure for their farm. And allows them to track the progress that's being made. And there's no other country in the world has such a system. And indeed, over 95% of our dairy farmers are participating in that. In terms of what's happening on farm and how we're supporting our customers, as I mentioned, there's no one solution. It's a series of management practices that can be made and have to be made on farm. But fortunately, we've seen real progress being made and interest also. I suppose when we meet our customers on a day-to-day basis, the first thing that they always say to us is that they know they have a role to play, but they want to know and they want to be educated on where to start and where is the right area to start. So from AIB's point of view, we very much focused on maybe aligning with key industry stakeholders to bring in information and upskill our customers on what needs to happen on a farm basis. We're proud to be associated with the Tag a Signpost programme. That is an industry-wide initiative to signpost what has to happen on a farm level and bring that education down to individual farmers, be it across all the subsectors in agriculture. We have a number of other initiatives also that we're involved in, such as the Grass Tin programme, which is focused on increasing the amounts of grass grown, the amount of grass utilised on farm, which automatically will reduce the imported feed requirement. Maybe just to give one or two examples of what progress has been made on farm in 2022. This year we have seen a 20% reduction in chemical fertiliser. We've seen a 47% increase in protected urea. And these are key management practices that have to be adopted by all farms. We've also seen farmers invest significantly in low emission slurry spreading, where the slurry is injected automatically into the ground and less ammonia being emitted and nitrous oxide being emitted into the atmosphere. And that was a key investment requirement for a lot of farmers. But again, farmers are only starting on on this journey. There is a significant amount of work to be done, but fortunately, we're lucky in this country also that we have a roadmap for the sector that's developed by Tagas under their Food Vision 2020 report, and we have a MAC curve that outlines exactly the management practices that farmers are making, that have to make on the farm, what the environmental impact of that farm, but also of those practices, but also what the economic impact of those practices would be. And our job in EIB is to support those farmers as they transition on that journey to a lower future, green future.
Very good. And Donald, just out of curiosity, if I'm applying for a loan, say at the medium scale, that will categorize under, a climate transition related loan, is the burden on me to prove to you that, look, this is a green type of a loan to get that accreditation from AIB and fall into that category, or is the burden on you to do that diligence? So does it result in more paperwork, harder yards than if I was just going in for a traditional commercial loan?
Yeah, no, there's certainly an increased focus in our risk analysis on what the ESG credentials of all our SME businesses and primary producers are no different. So in AIB, we've done a significant amount of work of upskilling our frontline to have more relevant conversations with the farmers, and also maybe we have a role to play there to upskill our customers on what needs to happen on that farm from experience that we're drawing where best practicing, sharing best practices on what's working well. So we're certainly having those conversations with customers. We're certainly looking for maybe confirmation of progress that's being made on farms, such as the Board BIA sustainability report is an excellent tool that a lot of farmers have access to. But I suppose our primary focus in our risk analysis on the ESG is maybe having quality conversations with our customers to ensure that they're on that transition journey, and how can we support them on that journey.
Super. Thanks, Donald. Terence, you lead KPMG's decarbonisation service line offering. When you look at that quantum that we said at the start of capital required to deliver on the energy transition and ultimately the electrification split across both projects and the broader grid infrastructure, how do you view that in terms of how it'll be financed, the capability finance, and just maybe give some flavour on the level of transformation required?
So the level of transformation is huge, James. Like we've very large scale programs that need to be delivered. And quite a number of them are large in capital. So look, we've already touched on 21 billion in renewable generation, 9 to 13 on what's called DSO, TSO, which is effectively EirGrid and ESB networks working together to make sure that the grid that goes from the largest data center down to your house is able to carry the electricity that will run that heat pump, that will power the car. And we'll come back to it in a moment, but while a good bit of that is labor intensive and materials intensive, so buying in steel and copper, a good bit of that will never build enough lines to people's houses to move all this power at the same time. So a good part of it is going to be a digital or technology solution. And like what I'll come back to is Ireland as a leader in that technology area with all the major tech firms here really should be looking at this going, what can we do rather than what do we need to do? So there's a large capital piece. Look, there's a bit of a spend in gas, but as saying about 2 billion, and there's a 10 billion to be spent on water assets. Again, usually quite controversial when we talk about water and how it's financed in Ireland. But there's capital programs across everything. You already touched on, how it breaks down is the public money, and that can be from the government or in some way aggregating together what customers have to pay for. So again, back to the power grid, back to the gas grid. It's regulated. The regulation can give certainty to investors that there will be repayment, because we need to upgrade the onshore grid network for both the new the generation which is going to be developed, but also for the additional demand that will be in our houses and in our business that will be electric, that's currently not electric. There's also, we need to spend about 2 to 3 billion in the next decade on developing an offshore grid. So there's a lot of talk about the offshore wind turbines that are going to be developed. They need to be plugged into the onshore grid. That's extra money. The private money we talked about, I think people really will have a feel about that. It's about investing in the assets that are probably less regulated. Still the wind and the solar. Hydrogen is very popular right now, but things like batteries and that. And then finally, the citizen, which I just wrapped so quickly, the citizen one is what the choices we make as consumers. Now, what's often not talked about, the lens I bring to it, so we've got the public, the private, and the citizen. But to come back to that, what can we do in Ireland? So some of these programs, we are going to be exporting our money. So we borrow it, we finance it, and we export it. We are not going to manufacture batteries in Ireland. We don't have the rare earth materials. We are not going to manufacture solar panels in Ireland. But when you look at that, we can keep that money within Ireland, within the water network. Capital programs, but it's concrete and cement and engineering expertise, and things that we can manufacture here, pumps. We can keep the money related to decarbonisation of the gas network. That is using the agricultural sector and our waste that we have to produce sustainable gas, biomethane, that's net zero. But again, if we invest in that and produce those facilities in Ireland, create job in the construction operation, that money stays in Ireland, because the source of it is not the Middle East, it is in Ireland. And then, like I said, a number of these transformations that need to happen aren't actually capital programs. It's efficiency and digitalization and knowing what's happening out there and balancing that my car and Andrew's car don't charge at the same time to overload the wire. But as leaders in technology in Ireland, we should be targeting that and not just going, well, how much are we spending, but like how much are we creating, and then sell that on to other people. Final one on that, and that's the obvious one, is while we move to a large amount of decarbonised power system and renewables are intermittent, what it means is we can't always rely on them. So what do? We build a lot more than we need. And people say, well, what are you going to do and how are you going to balance them? This is an envious position to be in. You look at the center of Europe, so Germany and the countries around it. When Russia's turned off that gas, they don't have indigenous resources to actually rely upon. So yes, we will have a shortage sometimes, but a lot of the time we're going to have an excess. And the question is, so we finance the projects here. We've a developed industrial energy development sector here. And then do we export the energy? Now, there's 3 ways we can do that. We can send it across a cable, a copper cable, and export as electricity. We could, the talk now is to produce hydrogen and mass export energy through that way. But the alternative way is we export products. So attract industry that wants clean energy. If we're going to have large surplus amounts of energy from our offshore resources, start building up our manufacturing capability here and export widgets or export bits and bytes through data centers. But, let's use what we have and not just look at what we're going to spend, but how are we going to restructure our economy?
Yeah, no, look, that's very interesting. I think there's an awful lot there from each respective speaker. Conscious of time, I committed to finish within 45 minutes. I think I'm going to break that commitment and go on a little bit longer because we've got a lot of questions in. So what I might just do is do a few rapid fire questions that have come in, and maybe to the panelists to give some degree of concise response. And firstly, Anne-Marie, to you, one question was, we've seen ESB raise a bond in 2019 and then 2022, the difference in those experiences. And if you were to raise it today, would the experience be very different as a first-time green bond raiser versus 2019 off the back of, there's precedent examples, but there's also significant evolution in the regulation landscape?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I think my camera might have failed, so apologies for that. I think if we were to go this year as a first time, it would be quite different. So I think going early was good for us. We got our green framework up and running. We got to think through our reporting. And whereas now we've got the EU taxonomy in alignment. So right now we wouldn't be prepared to go out with a green bond. We have a lot of work to do that. For somebody starting from scratch, I think that doubles up the work, because you need to bring your business on board. You need to get it all thought through, and then you need to look at the EU taxonomy alignment. So for us, doing it in the 2-stage approach has been really, really beneficial. That's not to say that people shouldn't be doing this. It's clearly the direction of travel, and I'd say in a few years' time, this would probably be the only way a company like ourselves would be able to fund.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of the key point, is that you're at the start, but this is just going to be mainstream finance before long.
Absolutely, yeah.
Andrew, one coming in for you. Given that the UK and Europe currently account for 82% of sustainable finance asset flows, what is the outlook for the UK and Europe and the European Union, that is, collaborating going forward in light of ongoing energy crisis, spiraling inflation, and sustainable finance generally? Or have they kind of delineated themselves, both the EU approach and the UK approach, from the sustainability agenda in terms of their approach?
Well, there's a lot of variables in that question, in all fairness, but I think from a broad perspective, it really comes down to a global demand. If I think about it from the European point of view, that'd be the EU European point of view. The fund platforms predominantly within Ireland and Luxembourg represent the demand globally for sustainability, right? And so if you look at Article 8 and 9 funds, I believe it's year to date, there's been about 427 fund launches within that space. I use those as shorthands for light green and dark green. But I think there's certainly the demand. So if I look at it in terms of the UK and Ireland or Europe more broadly working together, I think the UK is actually taking some cues from EU SFDR and how they will regulate it. Now, one thing in all fairness to the UK that I'm quite proud of as a industry participant is to see TCFD enforced as a matter of regulation within the pension fund industry, for example. So one of the most compelling aspects of that is setting targets for their portfolios. It's coming out in waves. Currently, those pension funds with more than 5 billion are subject to the TCFD requirements under the DWP regulatory regime. And ultimately that will go down to smaller size pension funds. But again, what's important about that is that they're requiring these large pools of capital to set targets. So if you think about the United States, it's being asset owner led by some of the largest pension funds, but there's not yet a requirement. And I think the UK is leading on that side. So the two working hand in hand to succinctly answer the question, I think actually make each other better. So we're going to see leadership from around the world. And I suspect that a lot of those folks outside of Ireland are looking to us to drive the market.
That's great. Thanks, Andrew. And Donald, two in for you. I'll give them both at the same time. So what kind of rate reduction are you looking at, or is it more risk premium being applied to non-climate aligned loans? So what kind of rate reduction for climate aligned loans? And then secondly, what biodiversity considerations, if any, are baked into current agri loans to ensure that finance is aligning with nature as well as just climate?
Yeah, thanks, James. And I suppose to answer your second question first, I think in relation to increasing biodiversity on farms and how we're approaching that and supporting our customers to do that, we see in the newly approved government Common Agricultural Policy Strategic Plan, increasing biodiversity is a key portion of that. So we know there's a 9.8 billion plan for Ireland for 2023 to 2027, where 25% of payments now out of Pillar 1 will be linked to eco schemes on which biodiversity will be a key pillar of that. So obviously, as we know, direct payments is a key component of any repayment capacity analysis. So again, we'll be looking at how are farmers participating in those eco schemes and are they availing of the 25% of their direct payments for those schemes. In addition, we've seen the government also announced this week a new 1.5 billion acre scheme, which is agricultural, climate, rural, environmental fund, again linked to improving biodiversity. And again, availing of schemes like that, where it's anticipated 30,000 farmers will participate in that scheme in 2023, increasing to up to 60,000 farmers by 2024, nearly 1 in every 2 farmers participating in that scheme by 2024, obviously improving repayment capacity and obviously allowing us to do more business with them. In terms of rate reduction or premium, I think we're very conscious of bringing low-cost financial solutions to our agri customers. Obviously, we have a stated target that 70% of our new lending by 2030 will be for green or transitional activities. And we're well on that journey. I think in our half-year results for 2022, that 23% of all new lending was for green or transitional. So we are on that journey, but obviously we have much more to do. And we want to incentivize, obviously, the right behaviours on farm. For argument's sake, one way we're doing that is that we're having conversations and with the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland, the SBCI, and we partnered with them every year since 2015 to bring low-cost sustainable or low-cost funding to our agri and SME customers. And we're currently in negotiations with them and having talks with them about a growth and sustainable fund for SME and agri customers, where 30% of any funding will have to go for sustainable initiatives on farm, and there will be a premium for farmers to participate or to get access to that fund. So there's work going on, there's more work, and we're going to see more of that early in the new year, I think.
And is that 23% of green loans, is that AIB group wide or is that the agricultural sector focus? AIB
group wide. That's our.
Well, that's essentially a quarter of all loans now linked. That's remarkable. And one of the final ones in here for you, Terence, emerging technologies such as hydrogen and battery storage, are they being funded by venture capital, by pension fund capital, or by utility capital or other?
So the hydrogen one is a bit early stage, particularly in Ireland. So if you're looking at the hydrogen sector, Ireland's economy is not really structured take it at the moment. So most of the hydrogen production and projects that are happening at the moment is to decarbonize existing hydrogen use. So let's step back, actually, sorry. Hydrogen is a very interesting molecule. Can be used in industrial applications as a chemical feedstock, can be used as an energy store, can be used in transport, can be used in power generation, can be used in heat. So it can be vectored into lots of things. If it becomes relevant in Ireland in the medium term, sorry, why it's interesting to people who are currently using it is because they work in some really dirty industrial chemical processes, which don't factor in our economy. So they're looking to displace that, and then into steel manufacturing and into plastics, things that don't exist in our economy. So if it takes hold in Ireland in the short to medium term, it'll be in the transport sector. It'll be where the buses or the heavy goods vehicles, effectively, it'll be more expensive than a battery vehicle. However, its utilization, the amount of time you can use that vehicle, such as in a port or an airport or a heavy goods vehicle, is much, much higher than the battery. So you're paying more, but you're getting more use of the vehicle that you purchased. Growing evidence won't be used in heat. And then the question is, can it become competitive over the longer term for an energy store and for power generation? So effectively, it's not working yet in Ireland because of the nature of our economy. UK, German economies, they're certainly investing in it. There are some funds investing in the likes of, decarbonizing steel or making green steel. But generally it's more the industrial players are self-investing to get going. A lot of governmental grants and the like, both in the EU and in the UK, to effectively kickstart it at this stage. But you're not seeing the other external money coming in. Batteries are a bit different. So definitely you could just about call the battery industry, we're not producing them or manufacturing them in Ireland established. It's on that cusp. From a grid scale, so a large battery that's going to operate on the power network, the difficulty is they are remunerated by a regulated market at the moment called DS3. Now, DS3 has been around for a couple of years and was due to be retired because it's a certain size. But unfortunately, there's a lot of uncertainty around it. So one, we don't know when it'll be retired. It's been extended. But while it's been extended, it also hasn't been increased. So more and more batteries have come in and they're chasing a fixed amount of money, which means they're earning less. So how it's been funded is largely by the utility players at the moment because they want to move early. They see it part of their portfolio. It aids renewables. There is an income stream there, but there's a huge amount of uncertainty and volatility around it. So it's very hard to finance with external money at the moment. If DS3, we get clarity around what comes after DS3, so the future arrangement system services, then you will definitely see there's money piled up and wants to get involved. But ultimately, when he looks at it, there's just too much uncertainty between here and now in 2025 to really draw in what's called money that's not come from the utility players.
Okay, very good. Well, look, I kind of feel within each vertical I could speak to each of you for probably half an hour at least on your respective spaces, and we have a huge number of questions that are coming in. Unfortunately, we won't have the opportunity to get them all. So, Andrew Farmer, Donald Welton, Anne-Marie Keane, Terence McGovern, thanks a million for joining us for this session on Finance the Climate Action Plan. Thanks for taking the time, and thanks to everybody for watching and participating.